The Black Death, the plague that transformed Europe. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina, carrying with them a cargo far more deadly than anyone could have imagined. The sailors aboard were dying, their bodies covered in mysterious black boils that oozed blood and pus. Within days, the disease spread through the port city like wildfire, and Europe would never be the same again. This was the beginning of the Black Death, the most catastrophic pandemic in human history, a plague that would kill between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa over the next 7 years. The disease that ravaged medieval Europe was bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This microscopic killer lived in the guts of fleas that infested black rats, the ever-present companions of medieval life. When an infected flea bit a human, the bacteria entered the bloodstream and traveled to the lymph nodes, causing them to swell into painful buboes, dark lumps that could grow as large as apples in the groin, armpits, and neck. Victims suffered from high fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and terrible pain. Black patches appeared on the skin as blood vessels burst and tissue died. Most victims perished within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms, though some died within hours. The plague also manifested in 2 other deadly forms: septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream directly, and pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could spread from person to person through coughing, making it even more terrifying and lethal. The origins of this apocalyptic disease lay far to the east, in the vast steppes of Central Asia. The plague bacterium had circulated among rodent populations in this region for centuries, occasionally spilling over into human communities. In the early 1340s, a particularly virulent outbreak began spreading along the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting Asia to Europe. Mongol armies, caravans of merchants, and traveling pilgrims unknowingly carried infected fleas and rats westward. One pivotal moment occurred in 1346 during the Mongol siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula. According to contemporary accounts, when plague broke out among the Mongol forces, they catapulted infected corpses over the city walls in one of history's first recorded instances of biological warfare. Whether this actually happened or the disease simply entered through natural means, Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa carried the plague to Mediterranean ports, and from there it spread across Europe with devastating speed. The medieval world was uniquely vulnerable to such a pandemic. Europe's population had grown substantially during the medieval warm period, creating densely packed cities with poor sanitation and no understanding of disease transmission. Streets were filled with human and animal waste, creating perfect breeding grounds for rats and fleas. Trade routes connected distant regions more than ever before, allowing the disease to travel from Sicily to Norway in just 3 years. The plague moved along rivers, roads, and shipping lanes, following the arteries of medieval commerce. It reached France and Spain by 1348, moved into Germany and England the same year, and swept through Scandinavia and Eastern Europe by 1350. No corner of the continent was spared. Rural villages, bustling cities, isolated monasteries, and royal palaces all fell victim to the invisible killer. The impact on medieval society was immediate and overwhelming. Cities lost half their populations within months. In Florence, the renowned writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed scenes of unimaginable horror that he later described in his Decameron. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves were dug outside city walls, and when these filled, corpses were simply stacked in layers and covered with thin soil. The living abandoned the sick, even their own family members, out of terror of infection. Priests refused to administer last rites, doctors fled their posts, and the entire social order began to collapse. Pope Clement VI, sheltered in his palace in Avignon, sat between 2 large fires that his physicians believed would purify the air, while 50,000 people died in the city around him. Medieval medicine was powerless against the plague. Doctors had no understanding of bacteria or how diseases spread. They believed illness was caused by miasma or bad air, often thought to result from an unfortunate alignment of planets or divine punishment for human sin. Physicians wore strange beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing these would protect them from poisonous vapors. They prescribed bloodletting, a treatment that only weakened patients further. Some recommended holding bread against the buboes and then burying it to draw out the disease. Others suggested drinking vinegar, eating crushed emeralds, or sitting in sewers to fight poison with poison. Nothing worked. The death toll continued to rise, and the helplessness of medical authorities only deepened the panic and despair. As the plague ravaged communities, people desperately sought explanations and scapegoats. Many saw the disease as God's punishment for humanity's sins, leading to the rise of the flagellant movement. Groups of religious zealots wandered from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in acts of penance, hoping to appease divine wrath. These processions often numbered in the hundreds, and their fanaticism sometimes led to violence against those they deemed sinful. More tragically, conspiracy theories spread that Jews had poisoned wells to cause the plague. This absurd accusation, despite being condemned by Pope Clement VI and contradicted by the fact that Jewish communities were dying from plague just like Christians, led to horrific pogroms. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349. Similar massacres occurred in Mainz, Cologne, and hundreds of other European communities, adding human cruelty to nature's devastation. Medieval medicine was powerless against the plague. Doctors had no understanding of bacteria or how diseases spread. They believed illness was caused by miasma or bad air, often thought to result from an unfortunate alignment of planets or divine punishment for human sin. Physicians wore strange beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing these would protect them from poisonous vapors. They prescribed bloodletting, a treatment that only weakened patients further. Some recommended holding bread against the buboes and then burying it to draw out the disease. Others suggested drinking vinegar, eating crushed emeralds, or sitting in sewers to fight poison with poison. Nothing worked. The death toll continued to rise, and the helplessness of medical authorities only deepened the panic and despair. As the plague ravaged communities, people desperately sought explanations and scapegoats. Many saw the disease as God's punishment for humanity's sins, leading to the rise of the flagellant movement. Groups of religious zealots wandered from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in acts of penance, hoping to appease divine wrath. These processions often numbered in the hundreds, and their fanaticism sometimes led to violence against those they deemed sinful. More tragically, conspiracy theories spread that Jews had poisoned wells to cause the plague. This absurd accusation, despite being condemned by Pope Clement VI and contradicted by the fact that Jewish communities were dying from plague just like Christians, led to horrific pogroms. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349. Similar massacres occurred in Mainz, Cologne, and hundreds of other European communities, adding human cruelty to nature's devastation. The economic consequences of the Black Death were profound and far-reaching. With so many workers dead, labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants who had been bound to the land for generations found they could demand wages for their work. Lords and landowners, desperate for laborers to work their fields, were forced to offer better conditions and pay. This shift in economic power began to erode the feudal system that had structured European society for centuries. In England, attempts by the nobility to suppress wages through the Statute of Labourers in 1351 sparked resentment that would contribute to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Agricultural production declined sharply as fields went untended, leading to food shortages and inflation. Trade networks were disrupted, and entire industries collapsed as skilled craftsmen perished. Yet this economic upheaval also created opportunities for survivors, who inherited land, property, and wealth from multiple deceased family members. The plague also transformed European culture and mentality. Art became obsessed with death, giving rise to the danse macabre tradition, depicting skeletons dancing with people from all walks of life, from peasants to kings, reminding viewers that death comes for everyone regardless of status. Literature and philosophy turned darker and more questioning. The unshakable certainty of medieval Catholicism began to crack as people wondered why God would allow such suffering, planting seeds that would eventually contribute to the Reformation. The experience of living through apocalyptic times changed how Europeans viewed their world and their place in it, fostering a sense that the old order was passing away. Despite its terrible toll, the Black Death did not destroy Europe but rather transformed it in ways that ultimately led to progress. The reduction in population meant more resources per person for those who survived. Wages rose, living standards improved for the working classes, and social mobility increased. The breakdown of feudalism accelerated the transition toward more modern economic systems. The failure of traditional authorities, both medical and religious, to protect people or explain the catastrophe encouraged a new spirit of inquiry and skepticism. This questioning attitude would contribute to the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the eventual development of modern medicine and public health. Universities expanded their study of natural philosophy, and physicians began to rely more on observation and less on ancient texts. The plague recurred in waves throughout the following centuries, though never again with the devastating impact of the initial outbreak. Smaller epidemics struck European cities regularly until the 18th century, when improvements in sanitation, quarantine practices, and changes in housing that separated humans from rats gradually reduced its impact. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed perhaps 100,000 people, and the Plague of Marseille in 1720 was one of the last major outbreaks in Western Europe. But the memory of the Black Death remained embedded in European consciousness, a reminder of human vulnerability and the fragility of civilization. The scientific understanding of the plague only came in the late 19th century, When Alexander Yersin identified the bacterium in 1894 during an outbreak in Hong Kong, the discovery of the plague bacillus and the role of rat fleas finally explained the mechanism of transmission that had mystified medieval physicians. Modern antibiotics have made plague treatable, though cases still occur in various parts of the world today. The disease that once brought Europe to its knees can now be cured with proper medical care, a testament to how far human knowledge and capability have advanced. The Black Death stands as a watershed moment in human history, a catastrophe so complete that it reshaped civilization. In the span of just a few years, it killed approximately one-third of Europe's population, fundamentally altering the continent's demographic, economic, social, and cultural landscape. It ended the medieval world and helped give birth to the modern era. The plague demonstrated humanity's vulnerability to invisible threats, but also its resilience and capacity to rebuild and transform. The Europe that emerged from the Black Death was different in almost every way from the one that existed before, more dynamic, more questioning, and ultimately more prepared for the challenges and changes that lay ahead. The plague was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, but paradoxically, the world that rose from its ashes was in many ways freer, wealthier, and more innovative than what had come before. The Black Death changed everything, and in doing so it created the foundations of the world we inhabit today.